The only woman in the house is the housekeeper, said Sholto. Something is wrong. We hurried to the door and knocked. A tall old woman opened it. Her face was white with fear. "Oh, Mr. Thaddeus, I'm glad you've come," she said. "I'm very frightened. Come into the house, Mr. Thaddeus. Oh, I'm glad that you're here. Something terrible has happened to your brother."
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.
Thaddeus Sholto began to shake with fear. His face was very white. "What do you mean?" he asked the housekeeper. "What is the matter with my brother?" "He locked himself in his room. He was there all day. When I knocked on the door, he would not answer me," she said. "I knew that something must be wrong. A short time ago, I went upstairs. I looked through the keyhole of the door of his room. I saw your brother's face, Mr. Thaddeus. It looks terrible. You must go up, Mr. Thaddeus. You must go up and see for yourself." The housekeeper started to cry again. "You must all go upstairs," said Miss Morstan. "I'll stay here and look after this poor woman." We left the two women, Miss Morstan and the housekeeper, downstairs. Holmes took the lamp and led the way. Thaddeus Sholto and I followed him. We climbed up the stairs. There was a passage at the top of the stairs. At the end of the passage was a door. Thaddeus Sholto pointed to this door. "That's the door of my brother's room," he whispered. We hurried forwards. Holmes turned the handle, but the door was locked. Then he bent down and looked through the keyhole. He stood up again, quickly. "My God!" he cried. "It's the work of the devil." I bent down and put my eye to the keyhole. I felt very sick and afraid. The bright moonlight was shining into the room. I could clearly see a face. This face was looking straight at me. It did not move. There was a horrible smile on the face. "This is terrible," I said to Holmes. "What shall we do?" "We must break down the door," he replied. We threw ourselves at the door, and it broke with a sudden crack. We were inside Bartholomew Sholto's room. Bartholomew Sholto was dead. He was sitting in a chair by a table. His body was stiff and cold. I could see that he had been dead for many hours. The dead man's body was twisted with pain. There was a horrible smile on his face. There was a piece of paper on the body. Holmes picked it up and read it. "Look," he said. In the light of the lamp I read with horror, "The sign of 4." "What does it mean?" I asked. "It means murder," Holmes replied. He pointed to Bartholomew Sholto's ear. "Look." I looked. I saw something sticking in the dead man's skin near his ear. "It looks like a thorn," I said. "It is a thorn," said Holmes. "You can take it out, but be careful. It is poisoned." I took the thorn between my finger and thumb. I pulled it away easily from the dead man's skin. I looked at it. It was hard and sharp. I saw that it had poison on it. "So, this is how Bartholomew Sholto died," I said. "What a terrible death! But who killed him, and why?" We had forgotten about Thaddeus Sholto. He was still standing in the doorway. Suddenly he gave a cry. "The treasure has gone," he said. "They've stolen the treasure. Look! Do you see that hole in the ceiling? We lowered the treasure down through that hole last night. After I had helped my brother with the treasure, I left him here in this room. I was the last person to see my brother alive. I heard him lock the door as I came downstairs." "What time was that?" asked Holmes. "It was 10 o'clock. And now my brother Bartholomew is dead, and the great Agra treasure has gone."
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.
"Go to the police station, Mr. Sholto," said Holmes. "Ask the police to come quickly. Dr. Watson and I will wait here." Thaddeus Sholto turned away. We heard him going downstairs. "Now, Watson," said Holmes, "we have some work to do before the police arrive. We must find out how the murderer got into the room. The door was locked, but what about the window?" He carried the lamp to the window and examined the window-sill carefully. "Look," he said. "Someone has come in by the window. Here is the print of a foot on the window-sill. And here is a round mark. And look, on the floor. Here is another footprint and another mark. And again by the table. See, here, Watson." I looked at the marks. Some were footprints, but some were in the shape of small circles. "Those are not footprints," I said. "No," replied Holmes. "They are the marks made by someone with a wooden leg." "Someone with a wooden leg?" I said. "Holmes, Thaddeus Sholto told us that his father was afraid of a man with a wooden leg." "Yes," said Holmes. "But the wooden-legged man was not alone. Someone else has been here too. Look outside." We both went to the window and looked down. "We are very high up," said Holmes. "A man with a wooden leg would not be able to climb here by himself." "Two people came into this room. We will call them number 1 and number 2. Number 2 is the wooden-legged man. But who is number 1? And how did he get in?" I looked round the room. I thought quickly. Then suddenly I knew the answer. In the ceiling of the room was a hole. Thaddeus Sholto had told us that his brother had made this hole. The Agra treasure had been hidden in the secret room above. The two Sholto brothers had lowered the treasure chest through this hole the night before. A set of steps was standing beneath the hole. On the floor by the set of steps was a rope. "Number 1 must have looked through the hole in the ceiling," I said. "He saw Bartholomew Sholto sitting on the chair below him. He killed Sholto with a poisoned thorn. Then he must have taken the rope, opened the window, and thrown the end of the rope down into the garden. His friend, number 2, the wooden-legged man, must have been waiting below. Number 2 climbed up the rope with the help of number 1. The murderers then lowered the treasure chest to the ground with the rope. Number 2 climbed down the rope. Number 1 got out of the room through the hole in the ceiling." "Excellent, Watson," said Holmes. "We shall now go up and have a look at the secret room. Perhaps we can find out more information about number 1. We climbed the steps and found ourselves in a small dark room without any windows. There was thick dust on the floor. It was here that the treasure had been hidden for so many years. "Look," said Holmes. "There is a small door in the roof. That is how number 1 got in." Then Holmes shone the lamp down at the floor. By the light of the lamp, I saw that the floor was covered with many footprints. They showed very clearly in the thick dust. They were the prints of bare feet. But they were not the footprints of an ordinary man. They were extremely small. Suddenly, a horrible thought came into my mind. "Holmes," I whispered, "a child has done this terrible thing." Holmes did not answer. He was still studying the tiny footprints. Finally, he spoke. "No," he said slowly. "I don't think it was a child. Look at this footprint. Look at the marks of the toes. They are very wide apart. It is not a child's footprint. It is a man's. They are the prints of a tiny man." Do you mean a dwarf? I asked in surprise.
I will show you,
replied Holmes.
Let's go into the room again. Let's examine once more the poisoned thorn which killed Bartholomew Sholto.
In the room below, I picked up the thorn. I held it carefully between my fingers. I felt afraid. It was long and sharp.
Now then,
said Holmes.
What do you think about this thorn? Is it an English thorn?
No, I said. It certainly is not.
You see,
said Holmes,
already we begin to know many things about murderer number 1. He is a very small man, in other words, a pygmy, from some foreign land. He is very strong and can climb great heights easily. He is also extremely dangerous. He kills people by shooting them with poisoned thorns.
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.
I looked at Holmes in astonishment. How strange, I said. Why are a pygmy and a wooden-legged man working together? Who are these people, Holmes, and why did they kill Bartholomew Sholto?
They wanted the treasure, of course,
answered Holmes.
Last night, Bartholomew Sholto was sitting in this room with the treasure. The pygmy came in through the roof and saw him. The only way to get the treasure was to kill Sholto.
And what about the paper with the sign of 4? I asked.
It must mean revenge,
Holmes answered.
Remember that a paper from the sign of 4 was also found on the dead body of Major Sholto. I don't know why someone wants revenge on the Sholto family, but we know that someone wanted revenge. They also wanted the treasure, and they were prepared to kill the Sholtos, father and son, to get the treasure.
Holmes took out his magnifying glass and started to examine the room again. There were some bottles and tubes in one corner of the room. Bartholomew Sholto must have been interested in chemistry. A glass tube had broken, and a dark liquid had spilled onto the floor. Holmes gave a loud cry of joy.
"Come here, Watson,"
he said.
"What can you smell?"
I walked over. Suddenly, I smelled something very strong and unpleasant. The smell was coming from the dark liquid on the floor. "It smells like tar," I said.
"It is similar to tar,"
Holmes answered.
"It is creosote."
He was smiling and rubbing his hands together. "Why are you so pleased?" I asked. Holmes pointed to the floor. I saw a clearly marked small footprint. I realized that the pygmy had stepped in the creosote.
"I know a dog which loves the smell of creosote. It will follow this smell for miles and miles," said Holmes. "We'll catch these murderers now." Just then we heard footsteps and loud voices outside the room. "It's the police," said Holmes. As he spoke, a fat man in a grey suit entered the room. His face was red and his eyes were small and bright. He was followed by a policeman in uniform and by Thaddeus Sholto. I'd never seen the fat man before, but Holmes seemed to know him well. "Good evening, Inspector Jones," said Holmes politely. "Don't you remember me?" The fat man stopped and stared. He was not very pleased to see Holmes. "Why, yes, of course," he said. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the private detective. Yes, I remember you well. This is an interesting crime, Mr. Holmes. A man has been murdered, and jewels worth £1 million are missing. What do you think happened?" "Well," began Holmes, but Inspector Jones did not want to listen to my friend. He thought his own ideas were better. "Listen, Mr. Holmes. I will tell you what I think," he said importantly. "This man, Thaddeus Sholto, tells me that he was with his brother last night. They discovered the treasure together.
He was the last person to see his brother alive. Now, I think that Thaddeus Sholto killed his brother. Then he ran off with the jewels." "Oh, no, it isn't true," cried Thaddeus Sholto.
"What about the poisoned thorn in the dead man's skin?"
asked Holmes.
"And the paper with the sign of 4?
"The thorn belongs to Thaddeus Sholto," replied Jones quickly. "I don't think the paper is very important. Perhaps it's a trick. But wait a moment. What's that up there? I see a hole in the ceiling. I must have a look." Inspector Jones went quickly up the steps. We heard him moving about noisily in the room above. Then he came down again. He was hot and dusty. "I know everything now," he cried. "I have found a door which leads out onto the roof. That was how Thaddeus Sholto escaped."
"But the footprints,"
began Holmes. Inspector Jones was not listening. He had not noticed the tiny footprints. He turned to Thaddeus Sholto. The poor man was shaking with fear. "Mr. Sholto," said Jones, "I arrest you for the murder of your brother." "I didn't do it," Thaddeus cried. "Please, Mr. Holmes, believe me."
"Don't worry, Mr. Sholto,"
said Holmes.
"I know that you didn't kill your brother. I will find the murderer."
Inspector Jones turned to Holmes angrily.
"Listen, Mr. Holmes," he said. "This is a matter for the police. It has nothing to do with you. Good night, gentlemen."
Inspector Jones and the policeman took Thaddeus Sholto away. A few minutes later the house was quiet again.
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.
"The police don't want my help, Watson,"
said Holmes, as soon as the inspector had gone.
"Inspector Jones thinks he has solved the crime and caught the murderer, but they have arrested the wrong man."
I agreed with Holmes. I was sure that Thaddeus Sholto was not the murderer.
"We must be quick, Watson,"
said Holmes.
"I want you to do 2 things. First, take Miss Morstan home. Second, go to this address, 3 Pinchin Lane. Ask for Mr. Sherman. He has an old dog called Toby. I want you to bring Toby here. Meet me here in 2 hours' time."